Testing. Oh, does my microphone work? Yes, it does. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. I'm going to kind of be over here, and if you want to sleep, this is the side to do that on, okay? If you don't know, first of all, I'm Pastor Tim, and I had detached retina a couple of weeks ago, and so thank you for your prayers. A lot of you have just been encouraging me through this. Basically, they did surgery, and now I'm just in a process of letting the eye recover, and it's at this stage, it's just really blurry out of this eye, and so it's easier to keep it covered than to have my brain do the double processing. So, but thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to get started with our conversation. And as the ZED Talk team was talking a little bit about some possible speakers, they said, well, maybe people would be interested in hearing a little bit about where I come from. And I hope this doesn't make you too nervous, but I am not Lutheran. I am a Calvinist, or I was, because I was never a very good Calvinist. And the more I've kind of discovered, particularly within the Lutheran Church and the ELCA, I think I probably would have been a much better fit all my life here than where I have been there. And so I'm actually in the process of transferring my ordination out of the Reformed Church in America, which is the denomination that I grew up in, to the ELCA. And at this stage, that's mostly just a lot of paperwork. And I know that because my wife went through the exact same process. My wife was also ordained as a Reformed Church in America pastor, and several years ago, she began serving, like I am now, as an interim in some ELCA congregations, and then she transferred her ordination over as well. The reason that I'm allowed to serve an ELCA church is due to something called the Formula of Agreement. And the Formula of Agreement was established in 1997, and it is an agreement between the ELCA, the Reformed Church in America, which is where I came from, and the UCC and the PCUSA, the Presbyterian Church USA, which basically says, look, we have some differences, but they're not that big, and we affirm one another's leaders and baptism and theology in such a way that we can be interchangeable in each other's pulpits. And so because of the Formula of Agreement, ELCA pastors have for many years been serving in the RCA, and RCA pastors have been serving in the ELCA, and that's kind of how I am currently credentialed through the ELCA. The Reformed Church in America that I come from is predominantly an immigrant church, like many churches in North America. It is Dutch in its ancestry, so you may have heard of it as the Dutch Reformed Church. Interesting story, there is also the Christian Reformed Church. So there was the Reformed Church, and it was really the first wave of immigrants. One of the interesting things about the Reformed Church in America is it is the oldest continuing and existent church denomination in North America. There has been a Reformed Church in America church ongoing since 1628. And so some of the very first churches in New Amsterdam, which is New York City, are Reformed Church in America churches. You may have heard of some of our former pastors. Norman Vincent Peale is RCA. Robert Schuller was RCA. None of that compares to the fact, though, that when I was a little kid, I learned that Geronimo was from the RCA. We have a great mission in Apache, Oklahoma, and he was part of that ministry there. The Reformed Church in America, again, comes out of the Calvinist tradition, and so we're going to do a little theology lesson and a little history lesson, and you're going to help me learn a little bit more about Luther and what Luther taught. I'm going to help you learn a little bit more about what Calvin and what Calvin and Calvinists have taught. And because I'm in process of getting my credentials transferred from the RCA to the ELCA, before I say anything else, we have to have a little agreement. You can't tell the bishop if I get anything really wrong here. I'm looking at you, Dr. Phil. Okay? I was a little nervous about doing this talk in front of such a prestigious crowd, but so you can correct me if I get some things wrong. Calvin, you're all familiar with Martin Luther. One of the things that we don't always understand is that John Calvin was not a contemporary of Martin Luther. John Calvin was a kid when Martin Luther nailed those 95 Theses. He was 8 years old. So Calvin follows in the footsteps of Luther, and in his earliest days of ministry was considered to be a Lutheran. There were, though, as there oftentimes are, moments where Calvin disagreed with Luther. And so there were some points at which Calvin said, yeah, you're getting that right, but I'm not quite so sure that you're getting this right. What's interesting to me, even in doing some of this preparation for this talk, is recognizing the difference, even in personality, between Martin Luther and John Calvin. Martin Luther considered himself, as I understand it, a pastor and a prophet in some ways. It set about to try to reform, not to break a new denomination, but to reform the Roman Catholic Church. John Calvin saw himself as a professor, and only later in life, through the encouragement of some other people, did he become a pastor. And I think that this plays really significantly into some of the trails that Calvin goes down that create some of the differences between Lutherans and Calvinists in general. And even looking at these two guys, so Martin Luther here on the left, John Calvin on the right. Martin Luther looks like a guy you'd like to go have a beer with. John Calvin looks like a guy who's going to give you some nasty comments on your term paper when you don't get your punctuation quite right. And genuinely, Luther was known as a very extroverted, he loved people, he loved the church and being with people. John Calvin was a scholastic, he was a scholar. He was very heavily influenced by the Enlightenment and by this understanding of the importance of knowledge and logic. And so many of the things in Calvinism, I think, actually flow a little bit out of even John Calvin's personality. And as I've been in the Reformed Church of America, so I have been ordained in the RCA for 27 years. I've served churches in Washington State, Idaho, Michigan, and Minnesota. And in that time, what I've come to understand is that so much of our theology is really influenced by our personality and by the way that we have grown up and been taught what the world is like, but also by the way we're wired and how we see the world. And I think this really kind of bears true for Calvin and Luther as well. One of the interesting things about the Reformation that Luther got started, oops, with this slide. So here you've got Jesus Christ, 30 AD. You are here. And you are here. And you've got some Orthodox, Coptic Orthodox, Arminian, Oriental, Nestorian, and you've got the Roman Catholic Church here. And then you have this, okay, so we got the Lutherans over here, and we got the Reformed Church, which is Zwingli and Calvin here. And you can just see, you Lutherans have done a much better job of containing the chaos than what us Calvinists have. And I think there's some reasons for that. And because I think that the more you try to define anything, the more answers you're going to get. And when you try to define God, and when you try to encapsulate who God is, the more you say about who God is and how God works in the world, the more people are going to disagree with you. And I think that in some ways, some of Calvin's professorial characteristics got carried on through his descendants theologically. one of my seminary professors, are there any doctors in the crowd here? Any PhDs? Okay, all right, this is bad. One of my seminary professors said, getting a PhD is all about learning more and more and more about less and less and less until you know absolutely everything about practically nothing. This much about this much. And I think that when Calvin tries to kind of really systematize theology, it creates room for all of these different ways that we disagree with each other. Anybody know how many different denominations there are in the world? So we started out with just a handful of different expressions of the Christian church. Roman Catholic Church was the kind of primary voice. Reformation happens and everything just explodes. Anybody want to take a guess at how many different denominations there are worldwide? How many think it's more than 1,000? How many think it's more than 10,000? Pastor Rob gets it right. 33,000 different Christian denominations or expressions of Christianity. That's what some might consider a mess. Others might consider an opportunity.
I was thinking of starting a new one this afternoon.
Yeah. After this talk, you're going to start your own denomination. All right, great. This is going really well. Remember what happens at ZED Talks stays at ZED Talks, and the bishop never finds out. All right, so we're going to talk about the 5 points of Calvinism. That was the title of the talk, and it's what Calvinists are kind of known for. Does anybody know the acronym for the 5 points of Calvinism? Does anybody know what that is? All right, it's right there on the screen. I should have waited for this slide. How many of you have heard that before today? Okay, so there is this acronym that many people, when they talk about Calvinism and what all of these descendants of Calvin theologically believe, they oftentimes talk about TULIP. And what's fascinating is that the 5 points of Calvinism were not articulated in Calvin's lifetime. They were not articulated by Calvin. They were articulated by Calvinists who were defending their faith against accusations by a whole nother one of those little subsets of Calvinists called Arminians. And so just like Calvin starts out as a Lutheran and says, there's some things I disagree with Luther on here, these points. Well, now what happens is, as Calvin goes on and starts teaching what he believes, there are some people who come along and say, I disagree with Calvin on some of these points. Those people were called the Arminians because they were followers of Jacob Arminius. And the Arminians basically said, look, you're getting everything right except for these 5 things. And what we see in Calvinism is that you have these beliefs around total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, perseverance or preservation of the saints, and we disagree. And so in about 1618, the Synod of Dort convenes to answer these objections and codifies in the canons of Dort these 5 points. And so what Calvinism has come to be known for is actually a response to people who disagreed with them. And I'm going to talk more about that at the end of this talk today, about why that's really dangerous. But first, I'm just going to walk through some of these. So total depravity is something that, and one of the things too to know is that in certain circles, to be a true Calvinist, you have to be a 5-point Calvinist, which means you have to agree with all 5 of these points. And so over here, I've got the Arminians, and they are 0-point Calvinists because they disagree with all these things. What I want to do is find out how good of a Calvinist are you, and how good of Calvinists are Lutherans. Okay? So total depravity in many of these different terms can oftentimes get twisted out of context and bent out of shape. Total depravity basically means that we are completely incapable of any act that would save ourselves. That's total depravity from a Calvinist perspective. How? Do Lutherans believe that?
Martin Luther's agreed with a Christian would say the same thing.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
I attended a class one time, but it was given by a Catholic priest who said that Luther was an Augustinian, and he thought that men were like raw meat, that they were totally depraved.
Okay. Right. So Augustinian thought that Augustine, sorry, says that men are like raw meat, totally depraved. And Calvinists in different shapes and forms can stress this to different degrees. I will say that I wonder, okay, so we would say, yes, Calvin would have agreed with total depravity. However, growing up in a Calvinist background, I was an ordained minister of Word and Sacrament before I had actually a Roman Catholic nun confront me, because I talked so much about my depravity, about my sinfulness, about my inability to do anything good. And she looked at me and she said, honey, what about your original goodness?
Yes. Yes.
What about your original blessing? And I think that may be one of the differences. So when I was trying to score you all, I gave you a 0.75 for total depravity. Because while you do believe that there's nothing you can do to save yourselves, there seems to be within Luther and Lutheranism also still an affirmation of the goodness of creation. And that really is lacking in Calvinism. There is a sense in which we are worms and we are unable, and that is really important. So I give you a 0.75, you can score yourselves. Unconditional election, it just basically means we are saved by God's choice, not by any activity or action that we take. Unconditional, it's unconditional. So we are saved unconditionally, and the choice is up to God. Now, where does Luther fall on this one? We're saved by grace. Through faith alone.
Another 0.75 for faith.
It is not your own doing, it is a gift from God. So, all right, I think we get a point here, all right? Lutherans get a point for unconditional election. Limited atonement. Aha! This is the sticking point. Limited atonement means that there are that when God elects, God only elects certain people, and that there is nothing those people can do to change their eternal fate and destiny. How does Luther feel about that? Boo! Okay, we got a 0 on that one. And honestly, that is probably the most, and I'm going to come back to this, that is the most significant difference, and it has huge implications. Not just between the difference between Lutherans and Calvinists, but I think even for some of the things we see going on in our world today, and our understanding of the Imago Dei, of the image of God in creation, the image of God in each other. Calvinists take this at times so far that, and this was kind of the accusation of the Arminians, was that basically they're saying that God chooses some people to go to heaven and God chooses some people to go to hell. It's called double predestination. And not all Calvinists buy into that, but there's a logical problem that happens when you start going down this line of limited atonement, that it almost becomes an inevitable thing. And within Calvinism, one of the things that really causes this to be such an important sticking point for them is that Calvinism is built predominantly around a celebration and a grounding in the glory of God, in the majesty and the sovereignty and the control. And so as I was growing up in the Calvinist tradition, what I was taught was that nothing happens outside of God's will. Even the bad things that happen are things that God somehow ordains. and that we just can't question God because God knows better. And there is within Calvin and within Calvinism, especially as it developed in later years, a sense in which God has to be defended at every point, and oftentimes has to be defended with logic. That everything has to make sense and has to work out reasonably, and that ultimately God is in control. And it's why they get to this place of limited atonement. And I'm going to come back to that a little bit, and we're going to move on, because we're going to find that there's probably also some agreement around some of these last 2 points. So irresistible grace is just this idea that God's grace will accomplish what God wants it to accomplish. And that when we seek God, when God chooses us, when God extends his grace to us, we are unable to resist that grace. That God will accomplish what God has purposed. Where do you think Luther and Lutherans are on this one? I'm really curious because Pastor Rob and Jen and I had a really fun conversation going back and forth about what this really means. And I think that there's some disagreement, and a lot of it revolves around how you define some of these, particularly this. What you do with God's irresistible grace has a lot to do with what you end up doing with limited atonement. I'm going to move on to, and I put a cross through because most people talk about this as perseverance of the saints, but that's not actually what the doctrine articulates. The doctrine really articulates the preservation of the saints. Because again, within Calvinism, the most important thing is to hold up the glory of God, the sovereignty of God, and the control that God exerts over the world. And so what this would say is, it's been used to say once saved, always saved. And the reason why that becomes so important is because people are, again, defending the integrity of God and saying God is in control and God will never not be in control, and even no matter what you do in life, you will never lose your salvation because once God's saved you, you can't be unsaved. And again, where's Luther fall on that? What in our conversation, Pastor Rob, where's Luther fall on that? I'll let you get in trouble.
I think my reading is that once you are in the hands of grace, there's nothing you can do to push God away. As my professor in seminary said, the parameters of grace are at least as wide as the parameters of sin.
Okay.
Right. And we make that claim in baptism, don't we? That once baptized, you cannot be unbaptized.
Okay.
No matter what you want.
Yeah.
No matter what other denominations want to be.
Yeah.
You are God's.
Yeah. Yeah, so again, depending on how you define these terms, really there is a fair amount of agreement between Lutherans and Calvinists on everything except for this point, from my understanding. And it's nuanced in different ways, but that there is a sense in which we understand we are people of grace. And that too is a huge part of what the Calvinists want to emphasize. But one of the authors that I was reading said, ultimately, where Lutheranism and Calvinism disagree, the difference between the two is primarily a matter of emphasis rather than a matter of content. And that emphasis becomes really important. And I'm actually going to use an illustration that Pastor Rob gave me that I have really appreciated. And I think this might have been one of your first sermons here, where he talked about the fig tree that was found in the vineyard. And he used these two pictures, or he used different pictures, but a picture of an orchard that everything is lined up and everything is straight, and a garden where it's just an explosion of life and color. My understanding of Calvin and Calvinists is that they try to see the world through lines that are straight and logical, and there's an effort to grow an orchard. And one of the things that I'm increasingly appreciative about not just Lutheranism, but I think many of the other expressions of Christianity that occur throughout the Reformation, and I'll go back to that slide, is that I think that we have this tendency to try to want to understand, to try to control, to try to put things in categories. And there's sometimes really good things that come out of that. But sometimes we need to embrace the messiness and the beauty that is found in the messiness. And I go back to this understanding of these two men in one who I'd be happy to go for a beer with, and one who I'd be afraid to get a bad grade from. And think about the fact that I think that Luther's understanding of life as a pastor first is a really helpful thing for us to understand when it comes to the diversity that we find within the Christian faith. One of my places where I have chafed throughout my whole life is around the Calvinist vision of trying to articulate everything in a logical format in such a way that everything kind of holds together. And I just don't think we're capable of really doing that. Which brings me to this slide. I'm sure you've probably heard this parable before, but there's a bunch of blind men wandering through a forest of the savanna plains, and they encounter an elephant. And they're all blind, and they all run into different portions of the elephant. And one says it's a spear, one says it's a fan, one says it's a wall, one says it's a rope, one says it's a tree, one says it's a snake. And in one sense, they are all right, and in one sense, they are all wrong. And if there's any hope of them finding out what the elephant is really like, they need to talk to each other. And they need to have some humility. And whether we are Calvinists or Lutherans or Catholics or Baptists or Presbyterians or Pentecostals, I think that this image has probably been one of the most helpful ones for me in understanding that there's a beauty that is found in the diversity of expressions and understandings of the Christian faith that is necessary and good, because God is so much beyond our ability to express and to say who God is and what God is all about as God does what God does in this world. Now, one of the other challenges is that I had a friend who once shared with me when we were working on some strategic planning stuff in church that people don't know what they want. It's a whole lot easier for us to tell, for us to tell someone what we don't want than to tell them what we do want. We define ourselves, both Calvinists and Lutherans, as Protestants, right? By our very name and nature, we are protesters. We are saying, nope, not that. Someone has articulated a truth and we've said, we protest. We disagree. And I've seen this lived out in the life of the Christian church in so many ways that what's fascinating to me is that Calvinism really exists because they protested what Luther was teaching. And then the Arminians protested what Calvinists were teaching. And in their defensive posture of defending their beliefs, they articulated these 5 points of Calvinism that now are really just a caricature of the complexity that they were really trying to express but couldn't ever really do. And now it's been devolved into this acronym, TULIP. And that's what people think Calvinists believe. And the fact is that Calvinists are as complex as any other faith group, as Lutherans, and there are so many more points where we have agreement than we have disagreement. And if you look through all the different names of all the different denominations that are just on this one map, when you start talking to these people, what you will discover is that all of us have way more in common than we have that divides us. But we have continued to divide because we've said, no, not that, and it's got to be this way. And I think that's a really important thing for us to recognize, even here at Zumbro. That God did not intend to give us merely an orchard or a vineyard, but a garden. And that we need to recognize that there is beauty and life and good in different expressions of the Christian faith and in different ways to express the Christian faith. And that the ministry of the church is so much more important than the different ways that we kind of tend to protest the things that we don't agree with. One last little story about where this can lead. So, my tribe immigrates from the Netherlands in the 1600s, 1700s, and early 1800s. They come to America. Most of them come with their own pastor. All of their services are in Dutch. But as their children are born, just like the Dinka congregation that will worship here later today, the grandparents all speak Dutch, but the children are learning English in the schools and are losing their Dutch. And so some things start to change. What happens is another wave of immigration comes 50, 60, 70 years later, and those good Dutch Christians come and find all these heathens speaking English and preaching in English and not in Dutch or Fries like God intended it to be. And so they form a new denomination. They split. So now we have the Reformed Church in America, and we have the Christian Reformed Church in America. In Holland, Michigan, which is the area that I grew up in, there is a church called Pillar Christian Reformed Church. If you've ever been to the Tulip Time Festival in Holland, all right, so beautiful tulips, there's a big white pillared church right downtown Holland, that's Pillar Christian Reformed Church. Used to be a Reformed church. But there came a controversy around whether or not you were allowed to belong to the Masonic Lodge and whether or not you were allowed to have your children attend public schools instead of Christian schools. One Sunday morning, a number of God-fearing believers took chains and chained the doors of Pillar Reformed Church shut, and then stood with axe handles outside those doors, threatening to beat anyone who would come in who disagreed with them. And what happened was the people who believed that you had to have your children educated in Christian schools and you could not belong to the Masonic Lodge were the ones who barred the door and the ones who held the axe handle. And so a new denomination was formed. That was the Christian Reformed Church. Fast forward to, I want to say, 1999, 2000-ish. The Reformed Church of America, the Christian Reformed Church, have mended many of our disagreements and are finding that we never really had that much that we disagreed with in the first place. And a joint congregation is established at Pillar Christian Reformed Church that is now Pillar Church, that is both a ministry of the Christian Reformed Church and of the Reformed Church of America. And what I think is so cool and is what they did is they built a new baptismal font. And the baptismal font is very beautiful, kind of glass like what we have here, but what holds it up are axe handles, bound together with chains. So at every baptism, they are reminded of their division and reminded that that is not their identity. That their identity is found in their baptism. And I think that is something that all of us, and from time to time, I've been through churches with worship wars. Well, we got to have the organ, we got to have the good old hymns, or we got to have drum, and we got to have praise band. We've had these fights over and over again, and it's so easy to lose sight of what we're for when we get caught up in what we're against. And so thus ends my ZED Talk on the 5 points of Calvinism, which may have been more than you expected, but I want to leave a little time for questions.
There we go. How about sanctification?
Sanctification.
That's a division. I think Calvinists don't understand Luther's simul justus et doctrine.
Okay.
And their logic and their need for apologetic defense of God, which God is ability to defend something. And so you end up with a lot of those divisions have to do with fights over what sanctification is.
Yeah. So as I was schooled and taught, justification is the work that God does in forgiving us from our sins and saving us and restoring us in new creation. Sanctification is this process that we go through of being and becoming more holy. And what's fascinating to me, though, is within Calvinist and Calvinism, one of the big things that people get hung up on is predestination. And that, there's some that are elect, some that are not elect. And as I just tried to articulate it myself, I really see predestination not as I have been chosen to be able to go to heaven someday, but that I have been drafted into an army. And that the predestination that Paul writes about, and this is what Paul actually says multiple times when he talks about predestination. He says, we have been predestined to be conformed to the image of Jesus Christ. He doesn't say we have been predestined to a place. He says we've been predestined to a person. And so while the theologians will disagree and debate and argue about the meaning of sanctification and what it is that we are sanctified for and to and what the process for that is, again, I would say the goal of it is something that we would all be able to agree on. I would think that within Lutheranism, the idea of becoming more like Jesus is exactly what sanctification should be, correct?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
This is where we might...
What is sanctification then, as you understand it, articulate sanctification?
At the same time as justification.
That it's
not a process. It's not that I become more holy as opposed to being less holy.
okay.
I'm as holy as I need to be.
All right.
We have to talk.
Yeah. Yeah. So yes, within a Calvinist understanding, sanctification is something that is an ongoing process. Whereas in Lutheranism, it would seem that there is more of a sense that it is a one-time thing that comes along with justification. And I would love, one of the things that was really fun for Pastor Rob and I was, these are really the kind of conversations that should be had in dialogue, not in lecture format. Because this is a conversation, and one of the things we're thinking about even for ZED Talks is looking at ways to, what would it look like to, on a Wednesday night, come back together again and then do it in a circle, and let's just talk about this together. Because I think this is this place where we are intended to be in community together, touching the different parts of the elephant that we found, and saying, hey, here's what I found. Yes?
Thank you. I would just make an observation. I started out Methodist and became Lutheran. But before we become too happy in our tulip garden, I believe the Lutherans attempted to create an arbor by way of the Augsburg Confession and the Book of Concord. We wrote several hundred pages under the work of Melanchthon detailing the parameters and the boundaries. And the thing that I've experienced over years is that other denominations, like the Presbyterians, have been more flexible in questioning their own documents like that, where we have a constitution that claims the unaltered Augsburg Confession. So, whether I'm not negative or positive, but there is a reality that we aren't always just tulips.
Yeah.
We try to make ourselves an arbor.
Interesting. Awesome. Yes.
But even in the middle of the Book of Concord, the Augsburg Confession, we talk about what is important to be church.
Yes.
And it's two very basic things. It has to do with the sacraments and the gospel.
Right.
And so all this other stuff is going on, and right in the middle of it is something very basic, and all the rest of it is peripheral, even by their standards.
Yeah. One of the interesting, and I'd love to learn more about the way that the standards are held in Lutheranism. In Calvinism, or at least in the Reformed Church in America, our standards, which are the Canons of Dort, the Belgic Confession, and the Heidelberg Catechism, are considered historic and faithful witnesses. But they are not, and they are part of our Constitution, but there's a little bit of wiggle in there in regards to, well, they are historic witnesses, but they are not infallible. And that might be one of the places where there could be some differences. So, again, thank you very much for joining us today. And I would love to have more conversation together. And so, feel free to pin me down and take me for coffee, and we'll chat more if you got more questions. All right? Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Pastor Tim. Now, don't you miss the coffee down here. I'll tell you what, if our coffee makers really need help, and our coffee making team has kind of dwindled. So if you want coffee down here, volunteer to help with it. Or run upstairs and get a cup.
Or run upstairs and get a cup. All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay,